You're sitting across from someone who genuinely cares about you. They're asking you a simple question: what do you want? And you feel your throat close. Not because you don't know, but because the act of wanting out loud in front of another person feels like standing naked in a courthouse waiting for a verdict. You learned early that your feelings had to pass an inspection before they were allowed to exist. Every excitement was met with, "Don't get your hopes up." Every mistake was dissected like a failed science experiment. Every victory came with a footnote about what you could have done better. And somewhere, deep in the architecture of your developing brain, you learned the most efficient way to survive. Become your own critic first. Beat them to the punch. Police your own joy. Flatten your own enthusiasm. Correct yourself before anyone else has the chance. It worked. You became impressive, disciplined, high-achieving, the kind of person others describe as put together. But here's the paradox that no one tells you about. The thing that kept you safe as a child is now the thing slowly suffocating you as an adult. You weren't raised with love. You were raised with standards. And now, decades later, you've become so good at meeting those standards that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be, without evaluation, without the mental red pen hovering over every moment of your life. This isn't about blame. This is about understanding that when criticism becomes the primary language of your childhood, you don't just learn to handle criticism, you internalize it. You become it. The voice that once came from outside migrates inward, sets up permanent residence, and begins to narrate your entire existence in the tone of someone perpetually disappointed. And the cruelest part? You don't even realize you're doing it. Because it feels like vigilance. It feels like self-improvement. It feels like the responsible thing to do. But it's not. It's grief wearing the mask of productivity. Let's name what actually happened. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called conditional positive regard, a term coined by Carl Rogers to describe when a child receives love, attention, or approval only when they meet certain conditions or standards. The opposite, unconditional positive regard, is when a child is valued simply for existing, not for performing. When you grow up with criticism as your primary relational currency, your brain makes a devastating translation. I am only acceptable when I am correct. I am only safe when I am beyond reproach. This creates what attachment researchers call an anxious ambivalent attachment pattern, but with a specific flavor: hypervigilant self-monitoring. Your nervous system never learned that rest is safe. It learned that scrutiny is constant, and therefore self-surveillance must be constant too. You develop what neuroscientists call an overactive default mode network, the part of your brain responsible for self-referential thinking, rumination, and internal narrative. Here's the metaphor. Imagine your psyche as a garden. In a healthy developmental environment, the garden gets sunlight, water, and space to grow wild in some places, cultivated in others. But in an environment dominated by criticism, the garden gets a team of inspectors. Every shoot is examined. Every bloom is compared to an ideal. Every wild branch is pruned before it can stretch. The garden doesn't stop growing. Gardens can't, but it grows strategically. It learns to only send up shoots that have a high probability of approval. It becomes a topiary, impressive, controlled, and fundamentally shaped by fear of rejection. The psychological term for this is introjection. You swallow whole the critical voice of your caregivers, and it becomes your own inner dialogue. The parent who said, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" becomes the adult voice that whispers, "Everyone else is doing better than you." The father who responded to your art with, "That's nice, but have you finished your real homework?" becomes the internal manager who can't let you enjoy anything without attaching productivity to it. And here's where it gets neurologically embedded. Repeated exposure to criticism during childhood, especially during critical periods of brain development, actually alters your anterior cingulate cortex, the region involved in error detection and emotional regulation. Studies show that children raised in high criticism environments develop a brain that is hyperactive in spotting mistakes and underactive in registering safety or satisfaction. You become, quite literally, wired for discontent. The cost of this is not something you can put on a resume. It doesn't show up in your bank account or your job title. It shows up in the quiet moments when you realize you don't know how to be proud of yourself. It shows up when someone compliments you, and your first instinct is to deflect, diminish, or explain it away. It shows up when you achieve something significant, and, within hours, you're already scanning the horizon for the next thing, because stopping feels like dying. You carry an invisible grief, the grief of a self you never got to be. The child who wanted to be silly wasn't allowed to be silly. Silly was irresponsible. The child who wanted to rest wasn't allowed to rest. Rest was laziness. The child who wanted to create without purpose wasn't allowed to create freely. Everything had to justify its existence. So you learned to abandon those parts of yourself. Not because they died, but because keeping them alive was too painful when they were constantly rejected. Carl Jung said, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering." But what do you do when your suffering was never considered legitimate? When your pain was met with "others have it worse" or "stop being so sensitive." You learn to gaslight yourself. You learn to override your own emotional signals. You become fluent in self-betrayal. And the cruelest cost is this: you sacrifice your authenticity for belonging, and you still don't feel like you belong. Because the version of you that earns approval is a performance. It's not you. So even when you're praised, even when you're included, there's a hollow echo underneath it all. The knowing that they don't actually see you. They see your compliance, your competence, your carefully managed presentation. This creates what existential philosophers call ontological insecurity, a fundamental unsureness about whether you have the right to exist as you are. You become an adult who is constantly seeking external validation to confirm your worth. But when you get it, it doesn't land. It can't. Because the person they're validating isn't the real you. It's the defended, polished, criticized into shape you. The fear driving all of this is not the fear of failure. It's the fear of being fundamentally unacceptable. It's the fear that if you stop performing, stop improving, stop managing yourself with military precision, the people around you will see what you've always secretly believed, that you are, at your core, not enough. So what does this actually look like when you're 35 or 42 or 27, sitting in a life you've built with your own hands but can't seem to enjoy? You might be the person who apologizes for things that aren't your fault. Not because you're weak, but because you learned that taking preemptive blame is cheaper than risking someone's disappointment. You apologize for your presence, your needs, your inconvenience. Because somewhere inside, you still believe that existing is something you need permission for. You become an adult who cannot accept compliments without a footnote. Someone says, "You did amazing," and you immediately respond with, "Oh, it was nothing," or "I just got lucky," or "Anyone could have done it." This isn't modesty. This is a nervous system that learned that self-celebration is arrogance, and arrogance gets punished. So you shrink your victories in real time, making yourself small enough to be safe. You might sabotage your own rest. Days off feel like moral failures. Relaxation comes with guilt. You can't watch a show without also folding laundry, answering emails, or mentally planning tomorrow. Because rest, in your childhood, was conditional. It had to be earned, and it was always temporary. Your body never learned that peace is a baseline, not a reward. In relationships, you become the person who never asks for what they need. You've trained yourself to be low maintenance, easy, undemanding. You pride yourself on how little you require from others, but underneath you're starving. You're waiting for someone to notice, to guess, to offer without being asked. Because asking feels like exposing the shameful truth that you need anything at all. You might struggle with perfectionism disguised as conscientiousness. You don't just do things well, you do them exhaustively. You research obsessively, prepare compulsively, and revise endlessly. Not because you love excellence, but because good enough was never safe. Good enough got criticized. So you aim for flawless, and even when you achieve it, you feel nothing, because the bar just moves. You become an adult who is terrified of being seen as mediocre. Not because you're ambitious, but because mediocrity in your developmental experience was met with disappointment or contempt. So you overfunction. You overperform. You become the person everyone relies on, not because it feels good, but because being indispensable feels like insurance against rejection. You might have a profound distrust of your own instincts. Every decision becomes a committee meeting in your head. You second-guess yourself constantly. You seek advice, research endlessly, poll your friends, because you learned early that your gut was wrong, that your feelings were overreactions, that your perspective couldn't be trusted, so you've outsourced your inner compass, and now you're lost. And perhaps most painfully, you become someone who cannot celebrate yourself even in private. You accomplish something significant, and within minutes, your brain is already cataloging the flaws, the things you could have done better, the people who did it faster, smarter, more impressively. Your internal monologue doesn't sound like a cheerleader. It sounds like a performance review. Always. Endlessly. Here's what you need to understand. These are not personality traits. These are coping strategies. They are adaptations to an environment that conditioned you to believe that your value was contingent on your performance. And they worked. They kept you functional. But they also kept you from yourself. The path forward isn't about becoming more disciplined or more resilient. It's about learning to witness your own pain without minimizing it. It's about recognizing that the voice in your head that sounds like you isn't actually you. It's an echo of the relational environment that shaped you. And you can learn a different voice. Healing from a childhood of criticism doesn't mean you become undisciplined or lazy or careless. It means you learn to separate standards from worth. It means you practice the radical act of existing without justification. This begins with what therapists call reparenting, specifically offering yourself the unconditional positive regard you never received. This isn't about affirmations or mantras. It's about building a new relational template with yourself. It's about noticing when the critical voice appears and gently asking, is this voice helping me grow, or is it just repeating old fear? It means practicing self-compassion as a discipline, not a feeling. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion shows that people who treat themselves kindly are actually more motivated, more resilient, and more successful, not less. The myth that you need to be hard on yourself to succeed is just that, a myth. What you actually need is safety. And safety doesn't come from criticism. It comes from being met with gentleness when you fall. You'll need to do shadow work, the Jungian practice of integrating the parts of yourself you've rejected. The part that wants to be silly, the part that wants to rest, the part that wants to make something imperfect just for the joy of it. These aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're exiled parts of your humanity waiting to be reclaimed. And crucially, you'll need to practice softness in the presence of others, not performing competence, not managing perceptions, but actually letting someone see you uncertain, messy, imperfect, and discovering that they don't leave, that you are, in fact, more lovable in your authenticity than in your performance. This is terrifying. It's also the only way through. There's a line from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke that has stayed with me. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. The dragon, in this case, is the belief that you are only acceptable when you're beyond reproach. And the beauty and courage is this: choosing to be human anyway. The truth is, you were never broken. You were adapted. You survived an environment that prioritized performance over presence, and you did it brilliantly. But survival strategies that work in childhood become prisons in adulthood. And you have the key now. You always did. Healing isn't about becoming fixed. It's about becoming whole. It's about reintegrating the parts of yourself you had to hide to stay safe. It's about learning that rest is not a reward, joy is not frivolous, and your worth is not something you earn. It's something you are. So if this resonated, if you felt seen in these words, know this. The fact that you're here, listening, reflecting, means you're already on the path. The hardest part isn't the healing itself. It's recognizing that you were wounded in the first place. And you just did that. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not broken for struggling with things that seem easy for others. You are simply someone who learned to survive in a relational environment that was not built for thriving. And now, you get to build something different. If this connected with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of these conversations. And remember, the goal was never to be perfect. The goal is to be real. And you're already enough.